Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I go into a 10-minute summary of this 90-page document, which is my job, I just wanted to mention that the end-use applications work that Annabelle was just referencing has been compiled into a report led by Nigel Dudley and Jessica Boucher, and tomorrow, during the end-use panel discussion, we'll have copies of that available. Okay, so this document I will try to summarize quickly. Please bear with me because it's pretty technical. So the KBA criteria can be used to identify sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of threatened biodiversity, geographically restricted biodiversity, ecological integrity, biological processes, and also biodiversity through a comprehensive quantitative analysis of irreplaceability. Globally threatened species and ecosystems face a high risk of extinction or collapse, and sites that hold these threatened biodiversity elements in significant numbers or extent make a large contribution to their global persistence. We have the first sub-criterion under threatened biodiversity is for threatened taxa, and here we mean species, subspecies, plant varieties, and isolated subpopulations that have been assessed as critically endangered, or vulnerable on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. And the thresholds for this criterion, so a site that has at least 0.5% of the global population of a critically endangered or endangered species, as well as at least 5 functional reproductive units, would trigger a KBA. And for vulnerable species, those thresholds are 1% of the global population and at least 10 functional reproductive units. For species that have declined precipitously, those that were listed under criterion A of the red list, the thresholds for KBA identification are set 5 times lower than those for other threatened taxa. That's not presented up here, but it's in the consultation document. And for threatened ecosystem types, these are ecosystem types that are listed as critically endangered, or vulnerable according to the IUCN Red List of ecosystems. And the threshold is a site that would have at least 5% of the global extent of an ecosystem for critically endangered or endangered would trigger KBA, and 10% for vulnerable. Criterion B for geographically restricted biodiversity identifies sites holding species assemblages, or ecosystem types with globally restricted distributions. These make significant contributions to the global persistence of biodiversity because there are a few other sites where these elements occur. For B1, for geographically restricted species, a site that had at least 20% of the global population and at least 10 functional reproductive units, regardless of its range size, would trigger KBA status under these proposed thresholds. For B2, this is about centers of endemism, and this threshold, it requires the regular presence at the site of at least 1/3 of the species within a vertebrate class or non-vertebrate order whose global ranges are restricted to the center of endemism. So criterion B3 aims to identify sites holding relatively intact species assemblages that are restricted to particular biomes. Work is still underway to determine an appropriate definition of biomes for application of this sub-criterion, and hence the threshold proportion of species, of the complement of species, is also still to be defined. And this is in square brackets because this is an area that we're seeking particular input in the consultation. And finally, the sub-criterion B4 is for geographically restricted ecosystem types. And here the threshold is any site holding at least 20% of the global extent of an ecosystem would trigger KBA status. Criterion C aims to identify truly outstanding examples at the global scale of natural and intact places that maintain fully functional ecosystems and their components. The threshold here is that KBAs under this criterion would be a site, 2 or fewer sites per region of outstanding ecological integrity, characterized by wholly intact species assemblages comprising the composition and abundance of native species, and their interactions. So KBAs identified under this criterion will likely be very large, ideally at least 10,000 square kilometers within the confines of manageability. The inclusion of criterion D for biological processes into the KBA standard is an explicit attempt to address species-level functional and structural components of biodiversity. Subcriterion D1, it aims to identify sites where species aggregate in large numbers for breeding, migration, and other key life history events. So the threshold is if the site holds at least 1% of the global population during one or more key stages of the life cycle, it would trigger KBA status. Under subcriterion D2, this criterion has been included because species may become concentrated in sites that maintain necessary resources, such as food or water, during periods of environmental stress, when conditions elsewhere become inhospitable. So sites that hold at least 20% of the global population of one or more species during periods of environmental stress, as their ecological refugia, would trigger KBA status. For subcriterion D3, for source populations, these are populations that make a globally significant contribution to the recruitment of species elsewhere. So individuals are moving out of the site in globally significant numbers for recruitment. And then finally, criterion E provides a comprehensively quantitative equivalent to the other KBA criteria for identifying sites of high significance for global persistence of biodiversity. So sites that score 0.9% or higher irreplaceability on a 0 to 1 scale, measured by a quantitative spatial analysis, and they have at least 10 functional reproductive units, or 5 functional reproductive units in the case of geographically restricted species. So this must be for threatened species got confused. At least 10 functional reproductive units of a species, or 5 if it's threatened, would trigger KBA status. So members of the Joint Task Force, led by Moreno DeMarco and colleagues at Sapienza University of Rome, have used techniques from systematic conservation planning to inform and calibrate the KBA thresholds by comparing sites identified under these thresholds with a comprehensive calculation of irreplaceability. Other members of the Joint Task Force, led by Mike Evans and colleagues at BirdLife International, have tested the implications of these proposed thresholds for sites identified through existing processes, using 7,500 sites and more than 23,000 populations. They've tested these thresholds. And this work has helped to clarify, or in our minds, the relationship between key biodiversity areas and systematic conservation planning, which is going to be one of the topics of the breakout groups this afternoon, and is an annex in the consultation document. Delineation of KBAs requires guidance rather than a set of formal rules because it's context dependent. The aim of KBA delineation is to derive site boundaries that are biologically relevant yet practical for management. So delineation is an iterative process that typically involves the following steps: assembling spatial data sets, defining initial site boundaries based on biological data, refining those boundaries to yield practical boundaries, consulting key stakeholders, and documenting the confidence in the delineation. Just wanted to point out that the delineation of a particular site as a KBA does not mean that the land or water outside of it is unimportant. Those areas may have nationally, regionally significant biodiversity or other cultural or ecological values. So Section 7 of the consultation document outlines the process for proposing a site as a KBA, and also explains how existing sites would be assessed under the criteria and thresholds presented in the KBA standard. I won't go into it in very much detail now, but I just wanted to point out that the process would be overseen by a KBA committee yet to be constituted, but that would provide the overall governance for this process. So the consultation document was posted online in early October, and so far we've received quite a number of comments from exclusively from the NGO and academic sectors. We expect many more comments both through this session as well as because it's open until the end of November, but I just wanted to quickly summarize the key points that were coming out. So most of the comments received today are on the criteria, the governance rules and procedures that are outlined in Section 7, relationship to other approaches, and the thresholds. But as you can see, we've had comments so far on most of the topics, and look forward to receiving many more. So from this point forward, our plan is to, respond to the comments that have been submitted through the online consultation as well as here during this session. We will likely convene a small meeting early next year to help us work through some of the more challenging comments, because it's going to be a lot of work. We will then revise the draft, and each and every comment that we receive will be responded to and posted online eventually. So this is why we asked for your name and institution. If you're very uncomfortable giving that in your cards, that's fine, but we will be making the comments public as well as our responses to them. We have begun the initial stages of drafting a KBA partnership agreement for those institutions that want to join in this process. This is a high priority following the World Parks Congress to draft this and work it through. We want to pilot test the standard, the criteria, and thresholds in a few key regions to ensure that they work in different environments and for different taxonomic groups. And our plan is to submit the revised KBA standard to IUCN Council next year, and then eventually to constitute the KBA committee. So please send us your feedback formally through the process, but also we're really excited to have your participation in this session. The consultation document is available both on the Stream 1 library of the Parks Congress website, but you can also find it at the website kbaconsultation.org. There's going to be a copy of it on each of the breakout tables for you to look through. And I just wanted to thank all of the people who've been involved in this process. I won't have time to thank them all, but there have been a lot, and we really appreciate all of the contributions that you've made and will continue to make toward this process. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jane to describe what we're going to do from here. Thank you very much.